doing this on coniferous trees, and you'll notice there's three different styles. This is very wet, this is medium wet, and this is on dry. I like to use the very wet technique for when it's off in the very far distance, middle ground, and foreground. Let's try and see what we can accomplish with controlling the amount of water on our paper. So here we go, just a plain piece of 200-pound Waterford paper, cold press, taped down to a plastic board. We are going to do a simple treat. I like to give myself a little bit of a guideline of a tree. You notice that it's basically zigzags, and all I've done is give it a quick little sketch. But what I've done for each one of those is I've drawn the center line, because when I paint this, I'm going to go from the center this way, center this way, back and forth from the center out, never across. That is my basic technique. Now, you can use several different techniques. You can use a simple 1/2 inch square brush for such a small tree. I'm going to start with my colors that I've gotten ready, and I've got a puddle of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I've got them in the big mixing area where they're going to mingle together, and I have a dark green. We'll not be using this blue, I don't think. For now, we're just going to simply use ultramarine, burnt sienna, and deep green. Okay, let's grab on our palette a little bit of ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I've dragged it through the dry area. And I'm going to start on dry paper. So I've got a nice little center that I've just dabbed in. Now I'm going to take the ultramarine, put it in with my burnt sienna to make a nice deep green. Do not over mix. You want to have a couple different colors. So you notice I put my brush on the center line, and I'm simply moving back and forth, reloading my brush as I need to, and dabbing it on dry paper. This is called dry brush. A simple but effective, very nice pine tree. Go back through, add a few little extra branches, and you have a simple dry brush pine tree. Okay, let's wet this paper just slightly. I'm going to use some clean water, and I'm going to wet the tree area. We want to make sure it looks like it is no longer shiny. You can see that it's shiny. We want to give it a minute or two to dry till it's still damp but not shiny. It dries pretty quickly. If you're in a hurry, you can always take your hair dryer and give it a quick little blast. Don't overdo it. Okay, let's test to see how far our color is going to run. Once again, burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and dab. See how far that runs. If it is not running far enough, make your paint a little bit wetter, and you can see that it's a lot more diffused than the dry brush. Let's go back to our dark green that we've darkened with our ultramarine. This time we're going to have to control the wetness of our brush. So we do that in two ways. We control it on our palette, and I look at how wet this paint is as I'm blending this paint to see how wet it looks. Then I'm going to try and see what happens over here. Take your time, slow down. You want to make sure that it's doing what you want it to do. Now, one of the tricks is not only watching what is happening, it's also how fast you move your brush. So you notice that it's very diffused here. That means I left my brush on the paper a long time. Now we have to move reasonably quick because we want to do this as it's damp, otherwise we get too many dry brush strokes. So you can see the big difference between these two trees. One's a little bit more diffused than the other. These are a little bit dry, so I'm going to add a little bit of water, and I've got a pretty darn good tree. Okay, we are going to wet this paper again. I use a nice wide 3/4 inch brush, and we're going to see what happens if we paint this same tree on paper that's still shiny. Remember, this one, the shine was off, but still damp. So we want this very wet. Because the paper is absorbent, I have to reapply water 2 or 3 times and give it a chance to get that paper very wet through and through. And it has to stay shiny. Now, let's see what happens with the same paint, same wetness of paint, and see what happens when I drop that on very wet paper. You can see how much further it ran than it did over here. That means we're going to get a very blurry, distant tree. Just like in the picture, we want it very blurry, very distant. You don't want your background to be so totally in focus that it takes away from the subject matter that might be in the foreground of your painting. Now, because I'm wanting this tree a certain size, I'm moving quite quickly so that I don't deposit too much paint. The risk here is that it might dry very pale. So before it dries, I'm going to go back in with a little bit darker paint in the same area and just give it a little tweaking to make it a little bit darker so that it will dry dark enough for me. Watercolors dry lighter, and you can see the difference between dry brush, semi-dry, and very wet. There is an interesting coniferous tree. Which do you think you want to try?